When I take this off screen, that's weird. Oh well, that's fine. Okay, folks. So we talked about claims. Now we need to talk about evidence. Just like with claims, I'm sure that on some fundamental level, you know what evidence is already. I mean, you were assessed on a category called evidence first semester. Like, you know what it is. But I want to give you some more specific language to think about it. And I also want you to be able to identify different kinds of evidence and have a sense of like when you might choose to use certain kinds of evidence in your own writing. And I want you to be able to identify the kinds of evidence that a writer is relying on. Though I don't really need you to practice it so much. You could say something like, this author relies entirely on lots of claims of fact in order to achieve a purpose. Like, use claim of fact as an X piece. You could also say, a writer relies heavily on quantitative data, or this writer relies heavily on historical information, or this writer relies heavily on expert opinion in order to achieve a purpose, right? So you can use these things we're talking about here as X pieces. You don't really have to, honestly. I think it's much better to use the things you've already learned about in most cases, but just know that that is kind of the hyperlink to what we did first semester. So see if I can make this clicker work here. I haven't used it in a long time. Oh, it's working. Cool. So yeah, just a reminder of our continuity here. We're transitioning from rhetorical analysis to argumentation. We need to discuss claims and evidence to support claims, both as other writers will use them, but also as you will be using them when we start looking at the argument essay next week. This is a sort of logical intermediate step between what we've been doing so far. So this is where your notes start. What is evidence? It is the facts or mostly agreed upon but still arguable claims of fact that writers use to support the claims they intend to argue. You'll notice there that I said mostly agreed upon but still arguable claims of fact. And this actually, I think, goes back to a question we had last week that I wasn't able to provide a complete answer to. There was a question about on our statement arguability spectrum. If you think about it for a second here, you had opinions on one side and facts on the other and claims in the middle. And I talked a little bit about how there's this little space here between claims of fact and facts, where there are some things that some people would call facts and other people would call claims of fact that are up for debate. And there is some gray area there that is sort of that we are wrestling with all the time as smart people. So you will find that writers sometimes will state things as if they are fact, especially if he or she knows that their audience is likely to take the things they're saying as facts, and then base an argument on those claims of fact, passing them off as facts, passing them off as evidence in support of claims. And that's actually a way you can attack an argument, is by essentially saying, look at all these, or look at the evidence that this person has provided. Actually, that's not a fact. That's a claim of fact. That's up for debate. Here are 6 sources that refute what this person is trying to pass off as a fact. Right? That's something you can do to address to refute an argument. So a major factor in the success of an argument is the quality and quantity of evidence used to support a writer's claims. There are 2 big kinds of evidence: first-hand evidence and second-hand evidence. And then there are 6 total kinds of evidence, or there are 6 types we're going to look at that fall into those categories. The 6th one is a little weird, and we'll talk about it. But generally, 2 buckets: first-hand evidence, second-hand evidence. 3 kinds of evidence fall in the first bucket. 3 kinds of evidence fall in the second bucket. This presentation is not exhaustive. I'm not saying that these are the only 6 kinds of evidence that exist anywhere. End of story. They're just the 6 most common kinds you're likely to find in the reading you'll be doing in AP Lang and in academia in general, and also the 6 most common kinds you might want to be drawing from when you are engaging in argumentation and synthesis too. Okay, so 2 kinds of categories of evidence: firsthand and secondhand. Firsthand evidence comes from what writers themselves know. It's personal experience, anecdotes, things they've heard from others, but that aren't otherwise published. Their friend told them something, or a group of friends told them a story of something that happened, and they're repeating that. Could also be somebody's general knowledge of events. If you're trying to make an argument about the experience of living through World War II or something, or that's probably not a good example. If you're trying to make an argument about the experience of fighting in Vietnam, and one possible source someone might consult about the experience of in pursuit of making that argument might be asking for the stories, the personal experience of a Vietnam veteran who today would be an elderly person. Secondhand evidence is accessed through research, reading, and investigation. It includes all kinds of factual and historical information, expert opinion, and also quantitative data. If a writer is, instead of pulling from their own knowledge, they're going outside themselves and they're finding data or information from another source, they're citing what someone else knows and not just what they know, that's secondhand evidence. Bless you. So, here you go. You got a little practice. There are 5 little chunks of evidence here that could be used to support random claims. Don't think too much about what claims are being supported here. I want you to think just about evidence. Here's a chunk of evidence that could be used for something. Is it first or secondhand? Try your best. Just a minute here. check your answers against somebody near you. So I still feel like all right, folks. Let's look at these here. According to the CDC, sneeze can generate a wind of 100 miles an hour. Yikes. That is secondhand evidence. You're citing the CDC. The CDC is a resource. So, secondhand evidence. This person tells a story about exactly what happened in this car accident. It's a person's story, so firsthand evidence. Third one, we are consulting a website about Microsoft Office and its history. Secondhand. We are consulting a book about World War II. Secondhand evidence. This is a story of somebody's experience going to a book release party in a bookstore. So firsthand evidence. Questions about any of those five? All right. Now would be a good time if you want to, like, in the corner, you can write down. I didn't tell you about this, but I should. All of these concepts are actually discussed in your textbook. Everything we talked about for claims last week is on pages 74 through 86 of your textbook. And the evidence section that we're talking about today is pages 97 through 105. I would have some claims of value to make about the means by which the textbook presents this information. But if you would like to read it in a different way or consume it in a different way, in addition to what we're doing together in here, you of course can go back and look at those resources. This like 3 weeks of AP Lang is probably much closer to the textbook and exactly the way the textbook like presents the information than the other things we're doing in the class. So I think it's worth looking at if you would like a little more instruction on these topics. All right. So first-hand evidence, we're going to talk about three types. The first type is personal experience. A writer's using personal experience to support an argument when he or she refers to his or her own knowledge, understanding, or observations to support their claims. Their own knowledge, understanding, or observations, their experiences to support claims. You will notice that very often writers will introduce and conclude arguments with their personal experiences. They're not particularly, personal experience evidence is not particularly robust or it's not robust enough in most cases to support academic claims by itself, right? Personal experience alone usually does not make for convincing support of claims. In fact, you could even wander into the weak argument territory that is a fallacy. To argue, this happened to me, therefore it's reality. That is a fallacy. That's not I think a hasty generalization, if I'm not mistaken. I hopped back. The next kind of evidence is current events evidence. Many people and organizations report on and write about current events as they're taking place. And then these reports create a body of facts from which writers can draw firsthand evidence. This is one of the major roles of journalism, especially news journalism in our world today, is to create this body of evidence, because in many cases, not always, especially recently, the basics of what happened isn't up for debate, and what happened is reported by a lot of different news sources across the political spectrum, and like the just the facts of like what happened, that information is doesn't necessarily need to be cited, or if it is cited, it's just cited from the original news source where it came from, and it qualifies as firsthand evidence. If you cite the Washington Post that's reporting on something that happened in DC recently, you don't need to cite any further than that, because Washington Post is enough. Like, it's a reputable news source. And that would be considered firsthand evidence because that reporter probably was there physically or virtually. Now, if provided information happened relatively recently, but it's not currently in the cultural spotlight, like it's not something people are still talking about, no one's really paying attention to it, it might be a different kind of evidence. I'm telling the difference between current events evidence and another kind, it's actually historical information. Telling the difference between those two takes a little bit of thinking. If it's out of a newspaper, likely current events, but you still have to go another step beyond that. If something happens and then someone is reporting on it right away around the same time that it happens, it's probably current events. But if something happens let's say something happened in 1995 and someone's writing, citing a newspaper from 1995 in a book they're writing in 2022, then that's historical information. It's not current events anymore. Third kind of evidence, first-hand evidence, is argument of fact. Sometimes writers will make a logical argument in support of a claim by piling up a series of facts or claims of fact that the author is expecting most people are going to just accept, most people in their audience, without necessarily citing those facts, without pulling them from current events. It's just like fact after fact after fact after fact, layered on top of each other in such a way that it makes a logical argument. This is actually very common. I think if all academic writing were just go find a source and cite it, and then or make a claim and then go find a source and cite it, and then go find another source and cite it, and then go find another source and cite it, that would actually be really boring. But it's not. This is very common, especially in synthetic type writing. Like a writer is trying to present new ideas to the world, trying to add to the body of humanity's knowledge. Yeah, they have to cite some sources to set up their argument, but then they have to go a step further and like make an argument about something new, presenting new ideas. And when they do that, this is how they do it. Here's an example of how this sounds. Can I have a volunteer to read this aloud, please? Somebody? Go for it, Julie. Thank you.
Too often, felon voting is seen as a partisan issue. In state legislatures, it is usually Democrats who try to restore voting rights and Republicans who resist. Recently, Republicans and election officials in Missouri and South Dakota have raised questions about voter registration groups and deployment of ex-felons, although they have every right to be involved in political activity. In Florida, the decision about whether a felon's right to vote will be restored lies with a panel made up of the governor and members of his cabinet. Some voting rights activists believe that Governor Jeb Bush has moved slowly and eliminated voting rights for few of the state's ex-felons to help President Bush re-election prospects.
Thank you. Can we have a power clap for that great reading? One, two, one, two, three. Thank you. All right. So I want you to see the structure here. You got our claim of value here. Felon voting is seen as a partisan issue too often. That's what makes it a claim of value, not the partisan, but the too often. And then right after that claim of value, there's a claim of fact to support it. In state legislatures, it's usually Democrats who try to restore them and Republicans who resist. And then and then this second half of the claim of fact, Republicans resist, is actually then supported by this like fact after fact after fact after fact. So he's effectively using, and there's no citation for any of these facts. He's not pulling this from any resources, or maybe he is, but he's not saying that he is. And so this would be an argument of fact. All right. Secondhand evidence. There are three kinds. First two are really straightforward. The third one is sort of funky. To support their claims, writers often pull verifiable facts about things that have happened in the past from research to support their claims. When I say things that have happened in the past, I mean that in the most liberal possible sense. Like, they cite sources. They could cite a history book. They could cite a census records. They could cite scientific reports. They could cite doctoral theses. Anything, right? If you're going and looking at the body of human knowledge through journals, through whatever other sources, and using that information to support your claims, it's historical information. I would imagine that any persuasive or argumentative essays that you've written in the past, I think they do this. This is a focus in 8th grade and again in 10th grade, right? So you probably did something like this. You pulled from research. So just like claims, telling a difference between a claim of fact and value was a common sticking point. In the claims presentation here, a common sticking point is telling the difference between current events and historical information. So you need to look at this piece of, or a couple things. Number one, how recently did the events occur with respect to the date of the argument's publication? So the event occurred on, let's say the event occurred on June 1st, 2021, and it was reported on in a newspaper on June 2nd, 2021. If someone's making an argument about that, about what happened on June 2nd, if they're, writing another report or a paper or something to publish on June 15th, and everyone's still talking about whatever this key event was, it's probably current events. But if no one in the cultural, zeitgeist right now is talking about that that event that happened in 2021, and now some academic comes along and writes a paper about something related to that event, cites that newspaper, that the citation of the newspaper would still be current events evidence because the newspaper was published right after what happened. Does that make sense? I see a couple nodding heads. Now, if an event happens in 2021 and a writer is doing some analysis of what happened in 2021, writing a book in 2022, but not citing the newspaper that happened like right around the event, maybe they're citing other sources, or they're not even doing citation at all. They're just referring to what happened. That would be historical information, not current events. So another thing to think about here is where the writer's getting the information. If they're getting it from a news article right around the time of the event in question, then it's probably current events. But if they're getting it from someone else's analysis of what happened, then it's probably not actually current events. It's historical information. Would anyone like me to explain the difference between those two over again? All right, so second type of secondhand evidence is expert opinion. Writers often bring in the opinions of knowledgeable people or experts in certain fields to support their arguments. And when you cite an expert, you have expert opinion evidence. Organizations or institutions can also be the source of expert opinions. So a recent publication by the Pauli College and Career Center reports that something, and then that would still be expert opinion evidence because the College and Career Center would have authority to talk about that, assuming that, their publication is talking about something that the College and Career Center would have the authority to talk about. It is, of course, important that the expert is an expert in that field and that the audience would perceive them as having the credibility to talk about whatever that thing is. If you're trying to write an argument about the success of SpaceX's launches, and you get your opinion, or you get your expert opinion evidence from a source that's presenting the actual statements of one of the engineers on that rocket, someone who worked on that rocket, then that's definitely expert opinion. If you are getting quotes about the SpaceX rocket from I don't know, Hulk Hogan or some random person, then that would not count because that person doesn't have the credibility to talk about that. Would not be a very strong argument. Third kind of evidence is the funky one, and this is quantitative evidence. On the surface, it makes sense. It's quantitative if it can be represented in numbers. Raw data or quantities, statistics, surveys, polls, census information, and much, much more. So, evidence that is based in numbers is quantitative. Now, I will say that the numbers need to be specific. If you see terms like several or a lot or many or a long time or countless or too much, it's not necessarily quantitative evidence. It's not specific enough. That wouldn't count. So generally, you can use the rule of thumb. If there are numbers, it's quantitative evidence. It does count as quantitative evidence. If there's a number in a proper noun, like someone is talking about what happened at the restaurant called, Five Guys Burgers or something. Yeah, there's a 5 in that name, but it doesn't mean the evidence is automatically quantitative. You have to think about it a little bit. Now, this is the sticky part. Evidence can be both quantitative and also another type. So when you're classifying evidence, you're ultimately going to choose which of the other five spots does it fit, and also, is it or is it not quantitative? You could get quantitative evidence provided by an expert. You could get quantitative evidence taken from a history book. You could get quantitative evidence from personal experience, right? How many bombs went off? How big were the explosions? How many people were injured? How many police cars came to the scene? The answers to these questions would be personal experience if someone were telling, a reporter, for example, based on what they observed themselves, but they would also be quantitative because numbers are involved, as long as the person gave specific answers. Yes.
So for quantitative evidence, would we say this and this type of evidence, or
Yes. When I ask you about this, it's going to be like choose one of the types of evidence, 1 through 5. Actually, 4. We're going to do 4. Argument of fact is not going to be an option. So, is this personal experience, current events, historical information, or expert opinion? 4 choices. And then separately for each piece of evidence, is it quantitative or not? Does that make sense? Okay. There are 6 practice prompts on the next slide. Please first figure out, is it personal experience, current events, historical information, or expert opinion? And put that on the left side where the big blank is. And then on the right side, you've got just a little teeny bit of space, like right here. And I want you to write just yes or no if the evidence is quantitative. Just a couple minutes. Okay. Check your answers with at least one other person at your table.
Quantitative. Yes. Don't know what.
Wait, the last one, yeah. I said no for the last two.
Okay, so first one. Over 900 teachers called in sick in the San Francisco Unified School District last Thursday. Very recent piece of information. I think this actually came out of a newspaper, current events, for this first one. It is, and I didn't write it on the, it's not going to show up on the slide, but it is, that one is quantitative. Yes, that's quantitative. You got a 900 there. Number two, the Associated Locksmiths of America was founded in 1955 and is headquartered in Dallas, Texas. Basic pieces of information like this fall under the category of historical information. I would say no, not quantitative for that one. Yes, there's a year, but the year doesn't, it's not a quantity, it's just a date. It's just an indicator of when something happened. On Tuesday last week, a judge stopped the development of a massive ultra-luxury resort in California because the developers failed to consider wildlife safety in their plans. Current events again, right? Tuesday last week, right? Very recent, reporting on something that just happened, and not quantitative. Rocket launch was a sight to behold. First, you see the flash, then a moment later, a loud, deep rumbling, not unlike an earthquake that rattles the windows and knocks things from walls. A descriptive personal experience of what the rocket launch is like. No quantities, not quantitative. According to Dr. Matthew Walker, driving a car after 2 consecutive nights of less than 4 hours of sleep is equivalent to driving with a blood alcohol level of 0.1 over the 0.1% over the legal driving limit. This is expert opinion. Dr. Matthew Walker is an expert on sleep research. The fact that he's a doctor alone is sufficient, honestly, for this to be expert opinion. You've got 2 consecutive nights, less than 4 hours of sleep, and the quantity 0.1%, which is of blood alcohol content. All of those are quantities, so it is quantitative. And then today's Palo Alto was once 2 distinct towns. Historical information about Palo Alto. Yes, it is quantitative. It says 2 distinct towns. All right, questions about any of those? Yes.
So if something is recent but really niche and unknown, would that be current events or historical information?
I would say if it's well known enough that someone else is writing about it, then it's, even if it is, even if the audience would be very narrow, it's probably still current events. Let me think about, I don't know, a person at a university in Liverpool creates a new programming language that's really different than any of the ones that currently exist. And probably only people interested in computer science would really read about that or care about it. but it's still news within that community. And I would, if you then cite this, this thing that happened, it would be current events. Does that make sense? Okay. Please grab the handout under the yellow cardstock. You got 14 minutes left in the period. That is your practice. I'm going to say something about it here. I will ask you to have this ready for class by Wednesday. Yes, I know this is a weird week. Wednesday, that would be January 12th. And your quiz will look almost identical to this, except it will only be 4 rows. The quiz on Wednesday on this content. So what I recommend you do is actually do the type of evidence first, because that's going to be the easiest. So as an example, I'll do this first one. According to Dr. Thomas Joseph Benjamin, SARS-CoV-2 can live on plastic surfaces for 3 days. Dr. Thomas Joseph Benjamin, expert opinion, right? He's an expert. So you should label that expert opinion. Now, what determines what kind of evidence it is, first or secondhand, which category it fits in, is what kind of evidence it is. So expert opinion is secondhand evidence. So you would put secondhand in the other box. And then you just check, is it quantitative? 3 days, yes, it is quantitative. That's how you do it. You can have the rest of this period to work. I am available to you if you have any questions. We'll go over this right before the quiz on Wednesday. It'll be pretty much the same class structure as we did today.